The morning shift always smelled the same: polished marble, brewed coffee, and something faintly citrus that never quite masked the bleach. We noticed these things the way some people noticed weather, without effort, without judgment. She adjusted the cart handle as she exited the service elevator on the 12th floor, its wheels catching slightly at the seam in the carpet. She made a mental note to mention it to maintenance, knowing she probably wouldn't. There was always something more immediate. Room 1214 was first. A Do Not Disturb tag hung crooked on the handle. She hesitated, then gently knocked anyway, the way housekeeping did when tags were ambiguous. No answer. She slid the keycard, pushed the door open halfway, and announced herself softly. The room was empty. Inside, the curtains were drawn back, flooding the space with late morning light. A suit jacket lay draped over the chair like it had been shrugged off mid-thought. The bed was untouched. On the desk, a laptop sat open, paused in what looked like a spreadsheet dense with columns and annotations. She didn't linger, she never did. Wee worked efficiently, methodical, careful not to disturb anything that didn't belong to her. She replaced towels, smoothed sheets, aligned toiletries with practiced precision. It wasn't pride exactly, it was respect. For space, for privacy, for the unspoken agreement between people who crossed paths without really seeing one another. As she wiped the desk, her eyes caught on the laptop screen again. Regression coefficients, she murmured under her breath, then stopped herself. It wasn't curiosity that lingered, it was familiarity. She closed the laptop gently, as if tucking something away, and moved on. Down the hall, the elevator doors opened again. Voices drifted out. Men, mid-conversation, unguarded. She recognized one of them instantly. Mr. Caldwell, a repeat guest, polite, always generous with tips, always distracted. They passed her cart without stopping. "I'm telling you," Caldwell said, lowering his voice but not enough. She was quoting peer-reviewed research, a Maid with a Harvard degree, no way. There was a pause. A laugh that wasn't unkind, just incredulous. "Maybe she Googled it," the other man offered. They disappeared around the corner. Wee stood very still. It wasn't the disbelief that unsettled her. She'd heard that before, in different forms, different accents. It was the casual certainty. The way disbelief didn't require malice, only assumption. She exhaled slowly and returned to her cart. If you've ever been misunderstood in a moment you couldn't correct, you know how quiet it can feel afterward. She finished the floor without incident, her movement steady, her expression unchanged. At noon, she signed out and headed toward the staff break room, stopping at the vending machine for water. Her reflection stared back at her briefly in the glass. Tidy bun, pressed uniform, name tag pinned slightly crooked. Lindiwe Dlamini. She straightened it. During her break, she pulled out her phone and checked the time in Johannesburg, more out of habit than necessity. A missed call from her mother sat unopened. She smiled faintly, then tucked the phone away. She hadn't planned to speak to Mr. Caldwell again. But later that afternoon, as she was restocking linens near the executive lounge, she heard her name. "Excuse me, Lindiwe?" She turned. Mr. Caldwell stood a few steps away, holding a folded newspaper, his expression uncertain now, like someone recalculating. "Yes?" she said. He hesitated. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but earlier, what you said about the data variance, it stayed with me." She waited. "I didn't mean to assume," he added quickly. "I was just surprised." She nodded once. "Surprise happens," she said. Something flickered across his face, not offense, but something closer to embarrassment. "Where did you study?" he asked. She considered him for a moment, not weighing power or pride, just intention. "Harvard," she said simply. "Class of 2016. Silence settled between them. Not heavy, but unmistakable. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Some stories don't begin with confrontation. They begin with a pause long enough for someone to realize they might have been wrong. If you're still with this story, thank you for noticing the quiet moments most people pass by. They didn't speak again that day, not because either of them wanted to avoid the conversation, but because the hotel had a way of absorbing moments before they could settle. Lindy Wee finished her shift, signed out, and stepped into the late afternoon noise of Midtown. The city moved the way it always did, taxis cutting corners too tightly, pedestrians negotiating space with practiced indifference, the air heavy with summer heat and impatience. She walked 3 blocks before allowing herself to think about it. Harvard, out loud, in his presence. She wasn't ashamed of it, she never had been. But she had learned, over time, that certain truths required context, and context required energy. Today, she had chosen simplicity. That evening, she sat at the small desk in her apartment, the one wedged between the kitchen window and the radiator. Her laptop hummed softly as she worked through a dataset she'd been revisiting for weeks, public housing access mapped against educational outcomes in immigrant neighborhoods. The work grounded her, numbers always had. Her phone buzzed again. Her mother this time. "Did you eat?" her mother asked, skipping the greeting. "Yes," Lindy Wee said, smiling. "I did." A pause, then softer. "Are you still tired?" Lindy Wee glanced at the screen, then back at her work. "Not tired," she said, "just patient." Her mother hummed knowingly. "Patience is expensive." "I know." They talked about small things, the neighbor's new fence, a cousin's wedding date, the price of groceries creeping up again. When the call ended, Lindy Wee closed her laptop and stared out the window for a long moment, watching a man across the street water a single struggling plant on his fire escape. Some people tended what they could, even when the conditions weren't ideal. The next morning, Mr. Caldwell requested her floor. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. Guests often preferred familiar staff. But when the supervisor passed along the request, she paused. "He asked by name," the supervisor said. "Is that okay?" Lindy Wee nodded. "Of course." Room 1214 was occupied this time. Mr. Caldwell sat at the desk, papers spread out, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of something, nervousness maybe, passing over his face. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, neutral, professional. She began her routine. He watched for a moment, then looked back at his work. Silence settled, not awkward, just unfilled. "I hope I didn't put you in an uncomfortable position yesterday," he said finally. She adjusted the pillows. "I didn't feel uncomfortable." "I did," he admitted. "After." She paused, then continued smoothing the sheet. "That happens too." He nodded, accepting the simplicity of it. "I work in private equity," he said, almost defensively. "Numbers are my language. When you mentioned variance thresholds, it caught me off guard." "Because of where you thought I should be standing," she said, not accusingly, just observant. He didn't argue. "Yes." That honesty surprised them both. "My degree doesn't change what I do here," she added. "But it explains how I think." He leaned back in his chair, considering that. "Why hospitality?" he asked. She took a moment before answering. "Because it's honest work," she said, "and because visas don't care about resumes." That landed quietly. He didn't press. Instead, he folded his papers and stood. "Would you—" he stopped himself. "If it's appropriate, would you mind looking at something?" She raised an eyebrow slightly. "During work hours?" He smiled, sheepish. Fair point. They both laughed then, briefly, humanly. Later that day, in the staff cafeteria, Lindy Wee found herself replaying the exchange. Not because it had been extraordinary, but because it had been open. People rarely admitted their assumptions without armor. Halfway through her sandwich, she caught herself smiling. If you're still listening to this story, it might be because you felt that moment too, when someone finally sees past the label, even if they don't fully understand what they're looking at yet. The following afternoon, Mr. Caldwell waited near the linen closet at the end of the hall. I checked with your supervisor, he said quickly. Off the clock. Coffee, completely optional. She studied him for a second, not his clothes, not his status, his posture, the way he stood like someone prepared to hear no. I finish at 5, she said. They met at a cafe on 46th. Nothing fancy, just chipped mugs and a chalkboard menu written in uneven handwriting. They talked about the city first. About rent, about how noise followed you even when you learned to tune it out. Only later did he ask, why Harvard? She stirred her coffee slowly. Because I was curious, she said. And because curiosity doesn't belong to one place. She told him about growing up in Durban, about scholarships stacked like stepping stones, about thinking education would be a door, and discovering it was more like a hallway. He listened, not interrupting, not fixing. I think I've been confusing proximity with merit, he said quietly. She smiled. That's a common mistake. They left the cafe separately. No promises, no declarations, just two people returning to their lives slightly misaligned from where they'd started. And sometimes that's how connection begins, not with certainty, but with a willingness to stay curious. If this moment feels familiar, you're not alone. Some stories unfold slowly because recognition does. Understood. I'm continuing strictly within the governor. No spectacle, no emotional shortcuts, no template escalation. This act will fracture connection quietly, not explode it. Here is only Act 3. Act 3, the breaking point, 750 to 800 words. It didn't unravel all at once. That would have been easier, cleaner. Instead, the tension arrived in increments, small enough to be mistaken for nothing, heavy enough to change how the air felt between them. They kept meeting. Coffee sometimes. A walk through Bryant Park once, when neither of them was in a hurry and the benches were warm enough to sit without jackets. The conversation stayed careful, thoughtful, never indulgent, until the day they weren't. Mr. Caldwell, Richard now, after she corrected him once, began asking questions that weren't about data or cities or work, questions that circled closer to intent. Do you plan to stay in hospitality? Do you miss home? Does it bother you being underestimated? She answered what she could, redirected what she didn't want to unpack. It wasn't that she didn't trust him, it was that trust had never been her default. The fracture came on a Tuesday. She knew because Tuesdays were the longest shifts, and by the time she reached room 1214, her feet already ached. She knocked, entered, and began her routine. Richard wasn't there, but his tablet was, resting open on the desk, screen lit. She didn't intend to look, she truly didn't, but the headline caught her eye before she could turn away. Impact Investment Opportunity, Urban Workforce Mobility. She froze, scrolling, a case study, a pilot program, hospitality workers, immigrant labor, a proposal framed as innovation, efficiency, mobility without permanence. She read enough to understand. When he returned to the room later that afternoon and found her finishing up, she didn't say anything at first. She handed him his folded jacket, met his eyes. Are you investing in my life? she asked. He blinked. What? The proposal, she said calmly. The one on your tablet. Color drained from his face. Not guilt exactly. Surprise. It's exploratory, he said quickly. Early stage, and unrelated to me, she finished. He hesitated. That depends, he said, on how you define related. The silence stretched. She set the cleaning cloth down with deliberate care. You didn't ask for my insight, she said. You studied my circumstances. That's not fair, he said. I value your perspective. Then why didn't you invite it? She asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. What unsettled her most wasn't the proposal itself. It was the realization that even now she was still being viewed as context. She had spent years refusing to be a case study. I won't be part of something that treats proximity as permission, she said. He took a step toward her. Lindy, she raised a hand. Not to stop him, to steady herself. I don't think you meant harm, she said. But intention isn't the same as alignment. She left the room before he could respond. That night, she didn't work. She sat at her desk, laptop closed, lights off, city noise pressing in from every direction. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She didn't answer. If you've ever felt yourself receding from something promising because the cost was clarity, you understand the shape of that silence. The next morning, she requested a floor reassignment. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? Yes, Lindy said. And it was true, just not in the way people expected. She avoided the executive level for the rest of the week. Richard tried once more. A message, brief. I owe you an apology, not an explanation, just accountability. She stared at the screen longer than necessary. She didn't reply, not because she didn't care, but because caring had limits. On Friday, she received an email from an old contact, an academic colleague now teaching in Boston, a short-term research position, modest pay, clean boundaries. She read it twice. Opportunity had a way of returning, quieter than before. She packed a small bag that evening. Not permanently, just enough to think. Sometimes the breaking point isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's the moment you realize you don't want to be understood if it means being categorized. If you've ever stepped back from something that almost fit, this moment might feel closer than you expected. Lindy boarded the train north on a Saturday morning when the city still felt undecided about the day. She chose a window seat, placed her bag beneath it, and watched the platform slide away as the train pulled forward. Boston wasn't a destination so much as a pause. The research position lasted 8 weeks. Enough time to remember what it felt like to be evaluated for her thinking instead of her proximity. Enough time to sit in seminar rooms again, where disagreement sharpened ideas rather than flattening them. She worked hard, she slept better, and she didn't talk about New York unless asked. Back at the hotel, Richard noticed her absence immediately. Not because of disruption. The rooms were still cleaned, the systems still worked, but because something precise had gone missing. He finished his stay early. The proposal on workforce mobility never moved past draft. Instead, he reread it one night in his apartment, seeing it now through a different lens. He recognized the problem not in its numbers, but in its posture. It assumed access was generosity. That observation was ownership. He closed the file. Weeks later, a single envelope arrived at the hotel, addressed in careful handwriting. Inside was a note. I won't pretend to know what this cost you, but I do know what it revealed to me. If you ever want to talk, not about work, not about fixing, I'd welcome that. No return address, just a name. The supervisor passed it on without comment. Lindy read it once. then folded it and placed it inside her notebook. She didn't respond, not immediately. At the end of her contract, she returned to New York without ceremony. She resumed her shifts, same uniform, same cart, same quiet attention to detail, but something had shifted. She noticed it in herself, the way she spoke more slowly, the way she no longer softened her certainty for convenience. One afternoon, as she was leaving the building, she spotted Richard across the lobby, not waiting, just there. He didn't approach right away, she did. "You look different," she said. "So do you," he replied. They stood near the windows where the light pooled unevenly. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said, "or to reopen anything." "Good," she said. "Neither did I." They walked outside together. The city absorbed them easily. They sat on a low stone wall near the park, watching people pass, a woman adjusting a child's backpack, a man arguing with his reflection in a darkened window. "I learned something," he said eventually. She waited. "That curiosity without consent is extraction," he said, "even when it feels polite." She considered him. "Learning doesn't guarantee change." "No," he agreed, "but it makes it possible." Silence settled between them, not strained, not rehearsed. "I'm still in hospitality," she said after a moment, "and I still research at night." "That makes sense," he said. "Both are about attention." She smiled faintly. They didn't make plans. They didn't promise continuity. But when they stood to leave, he asked, "May I walk you part of the way?" "Yes," she said. They walked 3 blocks together, then 4. At her corner, she stopped. "This works," she said, "not as a declaration, as a boundary." He nodded. "I know." As she turned to go, he didn't reach for her hand. He didn't ask for more. Respect, she had learned, was its own kind of intimacy. That night, Lindiwe returned to her desk, opened her laptop, and resumed her work. Outside, the city pressed on, indifferent, alive. She adjusted her name tag before setting it down, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. Thank you for staying with this story. Some connections don't arrive loudly. They arrive honestly, and only when we're ready to recognize them.